they have categorized us in a certain way. So they do see us, right? But I think what we really want to do is how can you respect us? So seeing us beyond whatever we can contribute to your life. So beyond entertaining you, for example, right? Or beyond what you kind of limit us to, but how can you respect us in our humanity and recognize that we have the same needs that you have? I think that is the disconnect more than helping them understand racism. I think most people are aware of what it is.
Welcome to the Networking with Michelle podcast, the show dedicated to providing you with life strategies with a little bit of entrepreneur advice. Here we believe in the Jim Rohn quote, success is nothing more than a few simple disciplines practiced every day. Hey everyone, welcome to the Networking with Michelle show. I'm your host, Michelle Gomez, and today is episode 4, Perspective of Black Lives. And the intro you heard is from our guest, Ewune Ewane, and we have a very thorough conversation on health disparities, particularly coronavirus and racial trauma, which is, I've heard and seen a lot, and I think we all have our own definitions of what trauma is and, what we've encountered. And I've never heard of racial trauma, right? And I came across her blog, and it was very informative. And language is important too, and we discussed that as well. But when I think about Trayvon Martin, 2013, and all of the videos and stories and media and images, social media, of course, from the past 7-8 years or whatever, however long it's been, and once again, recently, it's racial trauma and shit's crazy. Oh man. This conversation is it's important. So once again, it's about language. How do we identify something? How do we acknowledge it? And then how do we recover from it? And we discuss all of that in this episode. And, I don't know everything, but if this is your first time hearing about racial trauma, I want to encourage you to share this episode to family and friends, and then y'all get together while social distancing and have your own conversation about this, And I encourage this for all of our Black and Brown people, because there's just things that we go through that we shouldn't have to go through. And this conversation was a real eye-opener. I think I was a bit quiet because I was learning so much and I was being challenged. And once again, this is what it's about by having the tough conversations on this platform. So I hope you enjoy this conversation I have with Ewune. All right. Hey, everyone. Welcome back to the Networking with Michelle show. Today's special guest is dear friend, Dr. E. I like calling her doctor. Welcome to the show. How are you today?
I'm great. Thanks for having me. How are you?
Doing well. So why don't you tell the people a bit about yourself and your work?
Sure. So my name is Ewune. Friends like to call me Dr. E. I don't have my PhD yet, but I will within the next few months, thankfully. What I do is I'm a licensed mental health therapist and a health disparities researcher. I love working with minority populations. I've studied psychological experiences within African American or African descent communities, including Hispanic or Latinx communities. I love health disparities research because it really helps us understand the experiences of people beyond themselves that still have influence. And I also love giving back to the community and, extending my reach beyond one person. An example of that would be working with Child Protective Services, helping families, supporting families, and that everyone can benefit, not just the parent, but the child as well.
So today we're going to talk about the stages of grief through the lens of COVID-19 and racial trauma. Why is this an important topic right now?
Why is it a
important topic?
Because this is something that's been happening for decades, centuries even. The pain of systemic oppression. This has been going on beyond our regulation and as well as our ancestors. And the time is now. that's what it looks like. Part of me is, I'm not even sure. Part of me is excited because it seems like something is actually going to happen. But the other part of me is still a little hesitant because I've had my hopes up before. But there's no time like the present, and the global pandemic has really forced everyone to be still or stiller than they have been before. And when we are still, generally speaking, we're more aware of what's going on around us. And so maybe that's why this is something so pressing now, because we don't have as many distractions as we typically would have. There's no parties going on. There's no outings, there's no sports, right? And then the summer, so, the TV setup has kind of slowed down as well. And so a lot of us are watching the news. We want to know what's going on, and the time is now.
That is true. Let's go back a little bit, I guess, to March. And I think that's when we all became aware of the importance, or I don't know if importance is the right word, but that's when we became aware of COVID-19. Like, this is real on a national level. What were some of the things that you were seeing in your line of work during that time?
It was still business as usual, to be honest. I first heard of COVID-19, well, when it was originally coronavirus, was probably January.
Okay.
I started seeing articles and little references about it. And I think in February, I heard of some cases popping up in the United States, but I do recall initially it was labeled as the flu, another strand of the flu family, basically. And so with that understanding of what the flu is, I didn't take it very seriously. It didn't seem bothersome to me, as though what it appeared to be now. But that's what was happening before. So there weren't a lot of precautions being taken at the time in my agency. I think everyone was still business as usual, but there were still some whispers like, oh, the coronavirus is here in the country, but it wasn't in Texas, right? But when it actually came to Texas, I think that's when the alarm started. And it was probably around the time, about 2 to 3 weeks before the lockdown in Houston started, actually.
Okay. Yeah, I remember getting an email from my job. I want to say Sunday, March 15th. And it was like, oh, we're pretty sure we're going to shut down, or the state is going to shut down. And we went to work. Well, they were like, you can work from home for the next 2 weeks if you want to. And I went to work because I'm like, what is COVID-19? No, but I wasn't prepared to work from home, and so I just had to go to work for a couple of days and get prepared. And I think it was around the 18th or the 20th, I was like, okay, this is real. And I think that's when it hit me, and it kind of, I feel like I declined for a bit. And although I was on a decline emotionally, it's like my job became more stressful working from home. And although it hadn't affected my family at the time, it was just I was in a very weird space. I don't know. It's been an isolating situation, to say the least.
I can definitely relate to that too. I think I started getting concerned when major events were canceled. So, I had plans to go to South by Southwest. That was canceled. That kind of shocked me. And when the Houston Rodeo was canceled, that was a big eye opener for me, that it was very serious. My job didn't announce they were closing at the time, but I knew it was coming. And so I started making preparations for that, just making sure I had the files that I needed, the information I did. Because I knew any day now it would come. And it got to a point where the job was like, it's time for us to start working from home. We're going to go ahead and shut down for the safety of everyone. And that was an adjustment for me too. I didn't think it would be, because I've always wanted to work from home. But I definitely underestimated what that shift would be, as well as I can't go anywhere else. That was the thing too, right? So maybe working from home and you have the general freedom, to see friends, go to the store, etc., is one experience, versus it's recommended that you stay at home for as long as possible, right? So it was a struggle for me too. I had to adjust to the schedule. I had to find a rhythm for myself that helped me be productive, but then also kind of helped me deal with what I was dealing with emotionally. And I wasn't aware of it at the moment, but then it kind of just hit me. I'm like, you've never been in this situation before. And that's probably why, you're all over the place. And it may be best to kind of slow down for a second, regroup, and then continue forward.
I know there's been a lot of talk about the economic and health disparities, especially affecting Black and Brown people with the virus. What can you say about that? Or are there any other differences that you have seen that has impacted our community as well?
I think in any aspect you consider it, we're going to have negative consequences, or the most significant consequences of it, unfortunately. Health disparities isn't new. I think I have mixed emotions towards discussing of health disparities at this time, or, at the time we're referencing early when COVID really hit, because I think before we started discussing health disparities, people saw it as a national issue, generally speaking. And then once we started discussing that, African American descent or those of Hispanic or Latinx descent are experiencing death rates or, severe responses to this virus more than, white Americans, that's when it's like, well, we don't care. Let's go ahead and open up. That's what it kind of seemed like. That may not have been what was happening, but that's definitely the experience a lot of people report. It's like when they started talking about health disparities, things completely shifted. And the one thing people don't understand about health disparities is it's not the responsibility of the individual or even the community. That is a true systemic issue. I even think about when we talk about obesity, people tend to make it an individual thing. But when I studied health disparities regarding obesity in minority populations, there are several factors that significantly contributed to it that no one thinks about. For example, food deserts. When we tell people to eat healthy, one, do they even know what that is, right? But even beyond that, do they have access to these places, or are they far away, right? And if we tell them to work out or walk outside, there's a lot of assumptions with that statement. One of them is it's safe for them to be outside. Another one is, do they have sidewalks for them to walk outside, or are they walking in the streets? Another one is, do they have playgrounds or parks available for them to do some of these pretty easy activities that they wouldn't be able to do, like on concrete, for example? So there's a lot of assumptions that goes into it that most people don't think about, but that is not the person's fault, right? That's not the community's fault, but that is the government and the funds that they put into certain areas that cause someone to be more obese, or a community to be more obese than other communities. And I think the same goes to COVID as well. Healthcare access, discrimination in healthcare, those are all real factors that are beyond the control of the person. And it's hard because you can have insurance, right? And you can want to go to the doctor, but if the person isn't willing to listen to the pain you're experiencing, there isn't much you can really do.
All right. So I want to transition to racial trauma. How would you define that?
I would define racial trauma as heightened responses to racial oppression. So that could be heightened emotional responses, heightened mental responses, like certain thoughts that you may have, physiological responses. So that could be sweating, heartbeat, twists or knots in your stomach, or even behavioral responses, sometimes lashing out, being lethargic, no energy, for example. So it's whatever response a person has in response to systemic racism, racial oppression. And you don't have to experience it directly. It can also be you witnessing it, for example, and having that vicarious experience.
Do you think that only applies to African Americans and Latinos or Hispanics?
Short answer, no. Long answer, when we think about racism and who has experienced it, I would probably highlight, populations of color, definitely, with a special star on the African American community. But no, so I don't think that is unique to anyone, generally speaking. But, if we highlight the racial trauma the African American community has experienced, is very significant.
So do you think this is something that we should explain to white people since they're in the mood to learn?
So the thing about that is, I don't think it needs to be explained. I think it's a simple concept. It's a thought I've had personally, seeing the explanations and analogies people are sharing, and I think they're great. Like, they're really head on. They really capture what is trying to be communicated. But I always come back to, I don't think it's a matter of not understanding versus if white people are able to value and respect the humanity of Black people. That's what it really is.
Okay.
I think they understand trauma. I think they understand racism. I think we understand what that means. Now, some nuances such as microaggressions might be a little bit harder for them to understand because racial microaggressions are typically light, death by 1,000 paper cuts. And it's like little comments that are made that kind of, chew away or chip away at a person. So racial microaggressions, I think, would be something to be explained. But the concept of racism, I don't think it's a hard concept to grasp. And so I think the real question is, how do we get white people to respect and value our humanity? I think that's what the real question is. I always hear some people say, like the protesters, that's been happening right now, like, see us, see us. And I think white people do see us, but I think when they see us, they see what they understand Black people to be. So that could be entertainers, athletes, poor people, criminals, undereducated, the list goes on. But I think they have categorized us in a certain way. So they do see us, right? But I think what we really want to do is, how can you respect us? So seeing us beyond whatever we can contribute to your life. So beyond entertaining you, for example, right? Or beyond what you kind of limit us to, but how can you respect us in our humanity and recognize that we have the same needs that you have? I think that is the disconnect more than helping them understand racism. I think most people are aware of what it is.
There's a lot to unpack there. So one thing that comes to mind is recently this video of this comedian has been circulating. And one thing he mentioned was, Black people, we were just fighting for civil rights. And I thought that was interesting because, I look at the women's movement, I look at the LGBTQ community, and it's equal rights. And I wonder if that one word changes everything.
Equal?
Versus civil rights, based off of what you just said.
I think that's a really good question to pose. I think we can get into semantics, but I think the real problem is it's associated with Black people. I think civil liberties, equal liberties are able to be seen in most groups that aren't associated with minorities, right? So we have, I saw this meme and it was talking about different experiences of when certain groups have been highlighted based on tragedies they've experienced. And so they reference the bombing of the Boston Marathon, for example, and people are saying Boston strong, right? Or even when we had Hurricane Harvey, right? And then we had all of the slogans for Houston, Houston strong, Houston together, all those things, right? And that was acceptable. And I think people can grasp that, like, okay, this community has experienced something very traumatic, right? And they're banding together and they're trying to build themselves up, not only physically, but emotionally and mentally as well. And I think that can be understood. But I think when it comes to the African American community, that is what stops because it's associated with Black people. And so that's when, anti-Black or, racism or even prejudice comes into play because of that. So I don't think equal rights, I don't think civil rights really matter. I think it's because it's associated with Black people. And we are, and when I say we, I mean generally, people are downplaying or dismissing anti-Black or racism that's associated with us asking for things.
Have you heard of toxic positivity?
No, I'm not familiar with that. What is that?
The phrase toxic positivity refers to the concept that keeping positive only is the right way to live your life. It means only focusing on positive things and rejecting anything that may trigger negative emotions.
Yeah. I have heard of that. I have, yeah.
Do you think we can compare that to racial microaggressions?
Definitely. Especially if it's, again, confronting, anti-Black behavior or, prejudice behavior, definitely, because it makes a person feel uncomfortable. I think there's an image of a racist person that we tend to push in society, right? And I don't think we talk about prejudice enough, right? Because racism is associated with systems. So people in and of themselves, generally speaking, cannot be racist, but they can be prejudiced, right? And so that's holding a belief about a certain group that's, without basis, basically. And they're acting off of that prejudice, right? And playing into a racist system that will support them. So I think when we confront a person, with, oh, you're being racist or you're being prejudiced, I think they have that image in their head and they're like, that's not me, right? Like, I am not a member of the KKK, lynching, African-American people or burning crosses. That's not me. I'm not a racist. And they don't understand that racism looks different now. Prejudice looks different now. And racial microaggressions is one of those ways. So I think that's what it is, and when you confront a person with that, it makes them uncomfortable because it's like a cognitive disconnect. Like, I know who I am. And I think because I may have a Black friend, right, that I can be racist. And so that kind of challenges their perspective of themselves. And anytime you challenge a person's perspective of themselves, there's going to be some pushback. And so I think that's what the positive what is the phrase?
Positivity.
Toxicity.
Toxic.
Is that it?
Toxic.
Yeah, positivity, toxic. I think that's what that's referencing. It's just a discomfort, the cognitive dissonance of that. And people say, I'm focused on positivity and, I'm focused on love for everybody. And they're not really understanding what that means.
Yeah, some white girl she schooled me on that last week. But I like your breakdown of race and racism and prejudice. It's probably one of the best breakdowns I've ever heard. So I definitely commend you on that. How would you describe discrimination? And I would assume that still exists because it falls under that umbrella.
Right. Discrimination would be the act of your prejudice. So discrimination is a behavior. So prejudice is a belief.
Okay.
And discrimination is a behavior. It's acting out of the prejudice beliefs. And the system is just racism, I guess, and discrimination kind of fall together because racism focuses on the bigger picture and discrimination is the small acts that supports it.
So I read your blog post and lots of times is your blog post, what's the title of it again?
Coping with Racial Trauma on mindsovermelanin.com.
Yes. So I think I am a person that has gone through a lot of bullshit in life, a lot of trauma, right? Traumatic experiences. Mm-hmm. And, definitely been open about my experience with therapy on my platform. But I don't think people consider racial trauma and getting help for that. So how can we identify that we are going through racial trauma in that process of what does help look like?
So there's a couple assumptions with that I kind of want to address. I think going back to your previous question, like how do we get white people to understand racial trauma? Most therapists are white. And about 1% of psychologists are Black, I believe. And 3% of master's level therapists are Black. And so when we kind of think about that number, some of these people who don't understand racial trauma are clinicians. And I'm taking my time trying to run this through my head. But I think people may not be comfortable discussing that with their therapists. Most people who discuss their racial trauma do not discuss it with anyone outside of their cultural group. Because of some of the strong emotional responses that come out, right? And kind of thinking about how African American people have had to adapt certain defense mechanisms, such as keeping it cool, playing it cool, right? And so discussing your racial trauma will kind of prevent that process, because at some points you may get enraged, your voice may elevate, right? And some people don't feel comfortable doing that outside of protected spaces. So that could be one thing. The second thing is some people don't have a name to their racial trauma. They may say, I'm tired of this, this is bothering me, right? So they're just discussing their responses to it, but they don't have a name of it. And that's one of the suggestions for coping with racial trauma, putting a name to it, right? And so I've seen a lot of clinicians, being really open and, stressing that message, like put a name to it. This is your racial trauma. This is trauma, and typically, when people think of trauma, again, I'm speaking in general terms now, they think of like sexual assault, right? Some type of violence. They may think of like a car accident or unexpected death. So typically, therapeutically, that's how trauma is. And unfortunately, due to the lack of multiculturalism that exists within, mental health, racial trauma hasn't been included. It's up to a clinician of color to kind of address that, to bring it up. Personally, that is something I kind of talk about with my clients, even before this happened. I had one client who had a situation and he had an unlicensed firearm. And I took the time to talk to him about that. I was like, you're an African-American man with an unlicensed firearm. Like, are you aware of what could potentially happen? And he said, he really appreciated it. He's like, no one has ever really talked about that with me, And so I think they may not understand that, because that's not something we're taught to be transparent. We learn a lot of these theories, but most of the theories are not based on the minority experience. And so when we don't include minorities in our theory development, or even our intervention development, we lose those experiences, and we don't learn how to apply the theories or the interventional models to it. So the first thing I would say is kind of naming it, hoping that you're comfortable. I know a lot of clinicians now have discussed, like, how can I be anti-racist within, therapy with my client, right? And so there are a lot of clinicians, well, I'll take that back, not a lot, but there are some clinicians who are open to training other therapists in this arena, and who have also developed manuals for this arena to help with that. So I am confident that this is something that has legs, and will really take off. But, for people, I think it's just putting the name to it and just trying to put it out there and, see how it's received.
Yeah, I had a conversation with my therapist on Friday. So Sunday night, whatever day that was. But I was like, I need to take off of work. So when I went to work on Monday, I already knew I was going to take off on Friday. And then by the time Friday came, end of Thursday, I was glad I took off of work. Mm-hmm. And I already had my appointment with my therapist. So, she had to hear everything. So whatever was going on with me personally, kind of, I don't know, we discussed it, but last week was just a very emotional week for me, and dealing with stuff at work and then the community stuff. And it was interesting. And I can say, if I didn't read your blog post, I wouldn't be able to put the words racial trauma behind the situation.
I'm glad that was helpful for you. And I'm glad, no, seriousness, I'm glad that you have that safe space. In another webinar I did where we discussed, coping with trauma, racial trauma, and productivity, one thing that was highlighted was expressing that experience to your employers or to your coworkers, right? And some people felt very comfortable doing so, but I was on the other end of the spectrum. I was like, I don't feel comfortable with that type of vulnerability, and I know the emotional responses I have to it. It's something I do talk about in the blog, how I get so emotionally involved, like I kind of lose myself. And I don't feel comfortable doing that outside of safe spaces.
Yeah.
So I commend you for being able to do that. It sounds like your therapist was really supportive. So I'm very happy to hear that as well. And I hope other people feel comfortable doing that too. But I think the first hurdle for, African Americans who are interested in therapy is to go. And to find therapists, that are trained in this arena. And so I know melaninandmentalhealth.com, they have a really thorough therapist directory. Therapy for Black Girls also has another really good therapy directory. And, I would recommend people starting there.
Yeah.
I recommend you starting with minority therapists, primarily because they've experienced it personally.
Mm.
And so even if the training is, it's not new, but it's not as well disseminated. So not everybody has access to it, right? But they at least have the personal experiences to extend that empathy, to give you that safe space to really let it hang out. And, you're probably more free from judgment than you would have for someone who's not familiar with it at all.
Yeah.
One thing in the webinar we kind of talked about is, let's say if someone had a car accident and that information is shared with your employer or your coworkers, right? There's some empathy there. Like, oh man, you had a car accident. If you need some time off, no problem. And, they'll kind of give you some space to heal, right? And they recognize the trauma associated with that. But I don't think they can see that with racism, right? Yeah. Like, oh, what are you talking about? They were mean, right? It might be belittled. And so, it might be harder for people to express that because, again, it's not something globally understood, So that's why I kind of recommend going to a therapist of color because there is some understanding there. And at least in that space, you can express yourself and let it out because that's another way to cope with it. Let it out. Holding all of that emotion and all of that pain, it will kill you ultimately. And you want to get to a point where you can release that and redirect it as well, so redirect into something you have more control over.
It's a lot. I think there was some tension in my office last week and people didn't know how to address me. Like all of a sudden they didn't know how to address me. And there's a couple of factors in that. So it's interesting. And I do want to encourage everyone to seek professional help. And when I was offered my current role, I told my boss on the phone call, like, we negotiated salary. And I was like, well, I need time every month to see my therapist. Like, so nice. A long lunch or whatever, but I need that accommodation. And he was like, I don't have a problem with that. And I think by me saying it up front, when I schedule that time or take that day off, it's never an issue. So, I just say that to encourage everyone that's listening.
That was great tip.
Yeah.
That was a great tip.
But, it took me a long time to come into this. Like now, I don't care. You just, I want to just tell you what I need. And, and I had a lot of other things going on for me at that time. So I think there was just, it's a different confidence level, but I do want to encourage people that whenever you decide to get help, have that conversation with your boss or a new job you're going after. Don't feel like you have to stop your sessions because you're going to get a new job and you're going to go through this transition. That's probably when you still need help. So, and of course, all of these external factors that are going on as well.
Oh, yeah. I really like that. That's something I'm going to try to do myself. I think I would just, use my sick time and go to my appointments. I wouldn't think about, having that built in. I like that a lot.
Yeah. I mean, we don't always have to negotiate salary, so there's plenty of things to negotiate.
That is true. I learned that last year. But sometimes the salary is negotiable, right? And the other person, negotiate the benefits. And so that's why I have to talk to people to learn new skills. And one of those ways you can do that is going to therapy.
And my therapist is not Black. She's Latina, white passing. But I've been seeing her off and on for several years, for probably about 10 years. So that rapport is there. But there definitely has been times when I'm like, do I need to get a Black therapist?
I mean, overall, I wouldn't say, unless you had those concerns, if those were the issues you wanted to discuss, I would encourage that. Because again, racial trauma is then a trainings of how to cope with that are just now being shared in, broad streams. So if the therapist did not have a personal commitment to that, they don't have that training. That's the thing.
That's a good point. I think
so.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I think right now, like even with these companies, these brands and these messages, I think we're really starting to see people and their core values.
Mm-hmm.
What are your core values? And, how are you improving yourself? Because if you're improving yourself, that's going to determine how you show up in the world.
Absolutely. And even just understanding where your limitations lay. Mm-hmm. As a clinician, one of the things I noticed as soon as I entered the field as a psychology undergrad was, one, the lack of information on minorities, mm-hmm. and two, the gross overgeneralization of them, right? And it has been my passion to really address that. And, some of the things I've done is address, how we're treating, specifically our African American patients. I've had to discuss with colleagues about assumptions they were making. Yeah. And this is with understanding that, African Americans are significantly overdiagnosed or misdiagnosed with serious mental illness. And so kind of understanding that the way we process trauma or the way we express our psychological experiences is not going to align with the way that, our white American patients do. But unfortunately, because our diagnostic nature is based primarily on the white American experience, that is where the overdiagnosis or the misdiagnosis takes place. And if you don't have a strong cultural understanding of this population, you can miss it. And so that's personally something everywhere I go, every agency I'm in, that's something I bring to the table. And I'm sure, some of my colleagues get tired of that because I'm like, oh, here she goes, talking about cultural competency, but it's important. Yeah. It's important. And, if I'm the only Black person in the room, which I typically am, I feel like I have to say something. I have to, because I would want someone in that position to say that for me if I were the client. Let's look at this another way. Did you consider this? I think I should step in. And so that's why I said, shifting people back to, therapists of color for the time being until this information is really disseminated really well, because most therapists who are of white descent are not committed to racial trauma, right? Or racism or, systemic inequalities. Typically, no. Those conferences tend to be much smaller than the larger, more generalized conferences. So it's just something to kind of think about and just offering people extra lining of protection.
Yeah, absolutely. With so much going on right now, we're starting to see children of all ages protesting, participating in the protest. What kind of conversation do you think parents need to have with their child at any age?
I have mixed emotions. Okay. Because one part is like, you want to preserve the innocence of that child for as long as possible. And I definitely understand parents, regardless of their background, wanting to do that. But the other part understands that, unfortunately, some parents don't have that choice. And you have to kind of start talking about race once the child begins to socialize. Right. So
at what age is that?
I know, I was trying to think. I'm like, when did I have that talk? I don't think I had to have that talk because I noticed I was different. I grew up in a predominantly white neighborhood. And so I know my mom, she said I would come home and I would say certain things. And so she could tell that I realized that I didn't look like my peers. And I had a small issue with that. So I think 5, 6, it's a good time to start talking about it. There's so many books out there that can explain race on their level. So that's the thing. Children generally speaking, do really well in the environments that they understand what's going on. They do really well with changes if they can understand what's going on. And so it doesn't mean we have to go over, the centuries of oppression and, all that pain like that, versus just kind of explaining to them that, in their frame of understanding, this is the way the world works at this time. And this is how we handle it, right? And one of the things, another way to kind of cope with racial trauma in that aspect that you can apply to young children is to refute the ideas that people or society has made about you. So, for example, a young child, they may say that you're not smart. It doesn't matter what people say. You are intelligent, for example. So really rejecting, those stereotypes or those prejudice beliefs and, teaching the child to start building themselves up and having a buffer between themselves and others who don't support them. And that's something that children to adults can really work on, because that's another way to kind of help us cope with racial trauma.
Can you be too young for therapy? Like, depending on the trauma level? Because there's a lot going on right now, and I'm hearing a lot of things about kids at a very young age.
Well, my answer is going to be limited because I primarily work with adults and older children. But I do know they have play therapy, and that's typically recommended for 9 and younger. So it is possible. Again, it just has to be adapted to their understanding, so whether that is, role playing with the dolls, tell me a story, or color a picture, what's happening here, or have them read a book with you and ask them, how would this person feel in this situation? So there are techniques that can help the child and support the child. It just has to be on their level.
What else do we need to know?
Well, let's talk about recovery.
Okay.
How do we recover from trauma?
Okay. Trauma.
So the short answer, it is possible. Yes, you can. The long answer is it will take some effort, and it's going to be a continuous thing. Typically, when we think of recovery, that's under the assumption that the illness or the threat or whatever it is done, right? So you've been injured in some capacity, and now you're in recovery. When we think of like a physical illness, for example. The thing about racism is that this is the ongoing thing, right? It's systemic, it's continuous. And so recovery is going to look a little different. It's not going to be a one-time matter versus a continuous thing.
Right.
One of the first things I highly encourage everybody to do is to decrease your exposure. It's hard, especially right now. It's really hard. But it's important. Was it earlier today? I think earlier today, they were showing the video of George Floyd dying. And I asked myself, I think I even said out loud, why is this video still playing? Who hasn't seen this video? At this point, if you want, I haven't watched it personally because I don't watch them. But when they play, I turn the channel, right? But I'm like, at this point, why is the news still running this video?
Right.
If you want to see it, I'm sure you can Google it and you can find it. Why are they actively running this video? And part of me thinks it is one way to continue to traumatize our population, honestly. To increase feelings of hopelessness or helplessness. Yeah. Like, this is our fate. This is what happens. And even just normalizing Black death, right? Because I can't recall, and I want to know your experience. Have you ever seen a white person be killed by the police on film, on TV?
I did this week. Oh, not on TV, but on social media.
Okay. Any other time?
No. And even then, that was like partial of the video, but I get what you're saying. And the only reason I saw the video is because white folk were making the comment like, he died by the police and it's on camera. Where's the outrage? And then, I had to go in.
Oh, man.
I had to write novels on Facebook, and I was like, oh, I got time today.
Yeah. So you saw one. I cannot think of one. I'm sure they exist. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but I can't readily recall a film, but I can probably readily recall 10 different deaths that I know have been showcased on TV, right? That's a problem for me.
Yeah. No, you're right. And I even brought that up like in my response. So
Yeah, that's the problem for me. Especially for those of us who don't want to see it, you know? And I think one thing we can try to control is decreasing our exposure to that. So not watching the news as much, limit it to once a day, every other day. You don't have to watch it every single day, especially at a time like this. Try to unplug and reset, because racism has been here for a long time and it's not going away tomorrow or next week or next year. This is going to be an ongoing battle, unfortunately. And so with that, again, take time out, rest, reset, then come back, if you want to join the fight. But I think that's the first thing, just decrease your exposure and then reset,
I said the fight.
The fight. I mean, it is a fight. I don't think this is something that will go away by request, because if that was the case, it should have been gone, right?
No, you're right. It's a lot. It's a lot. And I feel for my people.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and you got to redirect the rage. You got to redirect it. So let it out in therapy, let it out on paper, write it out, let it out, and put it somewhere else. One way I put it into is my work, doing my work on the grassroots, making sure that if there is an African American client within my reach, that I'm ensuring that they have full competent care. Right? Mm-hmm. That's something I can control. I can't control the officers. Yeah. Voting, that's something I can control. Making sure that I'm showing up and supporting our communities. It's important. And I know people downplay it, but I always say, if that's the case, one, why do white people vote the way they do, right? And then two, why are they making it harder? Because if it didn't mean anything, right, if they could just do whatever they want, theoretically, then there wouldn't even be go to vote. We're still going to decide what the outcome is. So it's not quite as simple, right? And so it's just something to kind of think about. That's where you can put some control in. That's where you can put some power in. Another one that I've had discussions with friends about is reporting for jury duty.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think generally speaking, we tend to be reactive to sentencing, for example, or reactive to certain situations, and we can be more proactive. So we can actually be, in the jury that's deciding the sentencing for this, African American person, versus we just see the comparisons, on social media, like, oh, why did they get that? Probably because they had an all-white jury. So just really being involved and understanding that racism is a several 100,000 headed monster. And it exists in so many different realms, and every single realm must be squashed. And so for some people that could be protesting. For other people that could be writing grants to support, these organizations. For some people that could be making sandwiches and babysitting, making sure the people who want to go out there and protest have support for childcare, have proper nourishment, for example. So there's so many different things that you can do. And that is where I encourage people to really, put their rage in, because sitting with it, festering inside your body, that is one of the ways you can break down your immune system. So when people say stress can kill you, it's not an exaggeration. It's a literal thing. And one thing African Americans tend to experience a lot of is chronic stress.
Yeah.
We're stressed out every day, all the time. And one of the things it does is it makes us more susceptible to illness. It makes it harder for our bodies to fight off those illnesses. It also makes us more susceptible to drug usage. Because our body naturally has a way to cope or soothe ourselves. But if you're stressed out all the time, that natural ability dwindles down. And we need something else. That's when drugs come in, right? So that's what I'm saying. Managing your stress, redirecting your rage, those are real things you can do to prepare yourself for this long fight. We all want to be involved. We all want to make a difference in our way. And so those are some of the things that we can do. And putting a name to it, give it a name. It's not just feelings coming out of nowhere. It's not just thoughts coming out of anywhere. You have been traumatized. And this is you responding to trauma. And just like we understand PTSD, right? And how that works, racism can also result in that as well.
I feel like we just need white people to acknowledge that. Like, and I guess that goes back to the initial part of the conversation. But when you said that, I started thinking about, did you see the clip? I think it went viral yesterday or 2 days ago, but it was a middle-aged white woman in the convenience store harassing a Hispanic couple. She got slapped.
Mm-hmm.
And then, so what happened after that, her husband owns a law firm in Arizona. So everyone went to Yelp and gave a law firm back. So then the husband came out and was like, she has a mental illness or mental health issues or whatever he said or whatever. And it's just like, why do white people get to use that as a pass? And I feel like we don't have the same right. And, is it because we lack the language, or they just don't want to acknowledge the fact we may have mental health issues as well? I think there's a lot of things that go into that, but that's what popped in my mind.
A few thoughts. One, I've heard people say that racism or prejudice or discrimination is a mental illness. I hesitate to say that because in this age of technology, it's a choice. Mm-hmm. I firmly believe that. And I think that dismisses the lack of control a person can have who has an actual mental illness, right? Like the genetic components of it, or, the environmental stresses associated with it. Those are things people don't have control over, And so when you're like, well, racism is a mental illness, I'm like, but, what about the person who has depression, right? Do they just decide they want us to be depressed? Yeah. That's not fair to that person. What about the person who has an eating disorder or who has schizophrenia? Like, I think about my clients who are truly suffering and they want to be normal, right? Like, what's wrong with me? Why can't I be like other people? Why can't I experience happiness like other people? Because I want to be happy, right? So it's a desire that they have, that they work towards, that they haven't been able to obtain. I don't think that's how racism works. I don't think that's how prejudice works. Especially now, again, there's so much information. We talk about how it comes, right? What it is. We have all the history, what it's associated with, and people refuse to do anything about it. I think about Colin Kaepernick's kneeling. Mm-hmm. I think about, the reframing of Black Lives Matter to All Lives Matter, and all the explaining for all the years. This has been happening for years. Yeah. All the explain, like, this is not an extensive concept. This is not complicated. I have seen the house burning analogy. I have seen the cancer walk analogy. I have seen the biblical analogies, and they're all great. But it's like, you're choosing to go against reason. Mm. You're choosing to go against, facts. Right. And so that's just my hesitation, my personal hesitation with that. Yeah. And then, second part of your question. Again, I think, them being able to say, oh, these are my problems, because they recognize their humanity. It goes back to what we discussed in the conversation. Where is our humanity? Yeah. Right. And they can apply humanity to so many different situations, or to animals. Right. But to us, we're not allowed to feel. And when I saw that video, my heart was beating, because those are my heightened reactions to racial trauma. Right. Mm. So my heart was beating. I was stressed out. I hate watching those videos because that's what it does to me. And so again, that lady was in that young lady's face and that young man's face, poking, prodding, saying all these inappropriate things to them. Right. But they're not allowed to respond. And then when they finally had enough, or literally defending themselves physically, then there's a shock. How dare you? You hit me, right? That's what you did. I watched the video like 5 times because I enjoyed that slap. But in that moment, I was like, you were poking her. Yeah. Right? What happens when you poke the bear?
That's a good point. Yeah.
Right? But we understand that concept. But we don't understand it when it comes to people, right? Or non-white people. And, and I think about, protesting, they're yelling in their faces, they're spitting on people, and we just have to take it. We just have to take it. And you're free to just behave however you want to, do whatever you want to, make mistakes, panic, right? But we're not allowed to panic. We're not allowed to respond. We're just dead.
What are your thoughts on the Amy Cooper video?
Another thing that got my heart racing. Because again, I think that's a perfect display of why people don't have to follow the rules. Mm-hmm. They can do what they want, you know, and how dare you say something to me? That's how I interpreted it. You know, he literally was just like, hey, the sign says this, and there's a reason why that rule is there, right? And the way she flipped out is unnecessary. You know, you're embarrassed, whatever. I'm sorry, put the leash on. But she didn't want to do that. And going to the length that she did, that is why racism cannot be a mental illness. Because she knew what she was doing.
Okay.
I'm telling him, an African American man, she knew that was a threat.
She weaponized.
That was a real threat. Yeah, that was a real threat. And so I think that is one example of why this is not something that overtakes people. You know what's going on, you know, and it was that. And I'm thankful the outcome came out the way it did for him.
Yeah.
You know, and other people haven't been as fortunate, you know, and can't watch those videos because my emotional response, you even see that you can hear the way I'm talking. Like, it's just, there's no humanity. They don't see us as people.
Yeah.
Or, excuse me, not see us, because they see us. They don't respect us. You know, there's no human integrity there for us.
All right. So I know we've talked about a lot. Does society have a right to select who and what we advocate or protest for?
That's a tricky question for me to answer. Because when you say, do they have a right, like, are you referencing an opinion or an actual action that they can perform? I guess it's hard for me to answer. But I think overall, you know, most laws have some type of religious or spiritual foundation or association with morality. And morality, you know, definitely highlights care for all. And I think we have to move away from equality because equality is not sufficient versus, you know, meeting individual needs, because equal means everyone gets the same thing, right? Mm-hmm. But we understand that that may not meet the full needs of one over the other versus everyone gets what they need, which is fair. And so to answer your question, does society have a right? I think the squeaky wheel gets the oil. And I think communities to, you know, advocate for what their needs are. And I think based on what the foundation of our government systems are based on, like justice for all, then they should really focus on that for all, not for all who we acknowledge.
Okay. For all. So do you think Black people need reparations?
Yeah, definitely. But I definitely think reparations should be more of a package. It shouldn't just be financial. Because working in the communities that I work in, I can say confidently that money will not resolve all the problems that they have. And there's a lot of generational behavioral patterns that people continue to follow, although they know what the outcome is going to be. And it's typically detrimental, right? And so I think in addition to, you know, finances and policy development, there actually needs to be care for this population. They need to have specialized therapeutic approaches for this very specific need. Yes, because we can't, if we were to give everyone money right now, right? Let's say that reparations, here you go. Land, here you go. What would happen with that money and land?
Me personally, I would build a house and.
Okay, let's not speak personally. Let's speak generally.
I'm a capitalist, so you really are. Give me perspective here.
That money would go back where it came from.
You think so?
Yeah, eventually. Not immediately, eventually. Some people would do, as you said, build on it, use it, right? But others, again, they would follow the behavior patterns that they know. I think reparations should be more holistic. That's what I'm saying. Yes, money, but resources, right? They need full, competent health care, including mental health care.
You should run for president.
One day.
No, I like that. I like that. I respect that because I have not thought about that. And for me, my mission in life, my foundation and mission in life is the economic development of African Americans. So, especially at this age where that's a core value of mine, and anything that I do moving forward has to be aligned in that. Like I was invited to something earlier today involving the city, and they're like, you want to jump on this call? And I'm like, wait a minute, what area are y'all focusing on? Because it's not for the economic development of Black people. I'm not interested,
I commend you.
So I agree with what you're saying. I haven't thought about it before, but I do agree with what you're saying. I guess for me, I do believe that economic development is the foundation because money is a tool, right? I believe if we have the money, I would like to think we would spend the money on those resources, be it education, be it politics, agriculture, to better our communities. And that's my thought process. But I like what you said because our behaviors are true.
I mean, I hate to highlight it that way, but I think, again, we're trying to be progressive, right? And while money has its attributes, it's not magical. And so kind of what you're saying, like, oh, people get the money and they're going to do these wonderful things. If they haven't done it before, why would we anticipate they do it now without some type of education or training? Right. And then also remember, most African Americans live below the poverty line. So they have been in survival mode financially. Right. And it's expensive to be poor.
It is.
Right? And so when they're in survival mode, they have developed certain skills aligned with that. They don't know what it's like to be financially secure. And so with that, there's certain behavior patterns associated with that. And so I think economic training, financial training, education is important, one. And then two, how to address that trauma. Because again, most people haven't put a name to it, right? Most people don't know how to handle it because some of the ways that people process their trauma is through aggression, is through perceived apathy, but really it's just hopelessness, right? Another one could be increased reckless behavior because they're like, if I'm going to die anyway, let me just do whatever I want to do, right? And there's no right or wrong way to respond to trauma because it's all grieving and everyone responds to grief differently. And so when we think about the stages of grief, we have denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Even though we present it in like a 1 through 5 type of thing, it's not always continuous. So you can bounce from one stage to the next stage, to the next stage, to the next stage. And so that's why we kind of see some differences in how people are responding because of their grieving differently. And so that's one thing to understand. And when we kind of go back to the reparations talk, based on how they have learned, right? It may not be the most effective way, but that's what they know. And so in order to kind of support ourselves, not to backslide, so to speak, it needs to be more holistic and to address all the areas in which we have received pain. We haven't been traumatized only financially.
That's true.
So we have to kind of hit, again, racism went far. And so the reparations should reflect, the reach of racism.
I feel like I've been corrected. Okay.
Not corrected. We're just adding to the picture, putting more color in it.
Yeah, I love it. Okay. And you're right, because there's so many systems. This lady did a video the other day. She said white people are delusional within the system of racism because, they don't see it, and me, I think everyone's delusional, but
we all have our delusions. Yeah, but when you think about delusion, it's a strongly held belief, that's not supported by facts, right? And even when you're presented with information, you still decline. So, yeah, I would agree with that.
Yeah, I learned that from you. So I guess my thing is, can we really have social cohesion amongst all of the races and ethnic groups and cultures and everything in the United States of America?
Short answer, yes.
You're so hopeful.
I mean, yes, we can, right? We definitely can. But I think the long answer reflects the work that needs to be done for that to happen.
Okay.
And so there's a lot of different, suggestions and theories and approaches. And I think they're all relevant because, again, this has spread, right? And so I don't think there's a one size fits all approach to this. So I do think it can happen, but it's going to require a lot of effort, I think one thing it's going to require is grace. Again, understanding that people process trauma differently. Mm-hmm. So how I express my activism is not going to look like yours.
Right.
Right. And my activism could be internal. It could be me saying prayers, it could be me meditating. So I want people to remember that it may not always be an external experience that is, viewable by other people. It can also be something internal as well. And that's perfectly fine. Another way to extend grace is understanding that this is a grieving process. We're grieving. I saw this meme that said, we're not just crying for George Floyd. These tears started with Emmett Till.
Yeah.
And even started before then.
Yeah.
Right. But this is something that is pervasive. And so remembering some people are in denial. That is a stage of grief. So that's why we have some of our peers who downplay the significance of it, right? Or who play the devil's advocate, for example, right? Or who decline the experiences by other people because they aren't personal experiences of their own. That is one stage of it. And recognizing that and letting that person be where they are. Because one of the things I want to bring to people's attention is the weight that we feel when we recognize our pain and the racial trauma is heavy. Mm. And that concept for some people may be more than what they can bear.
Right.
And it is a coping skill or even a defense mechanism to deny it. So just kind of trying to see it from their perspective and extending grace to that person that this may be too painful for them. And the best approach for them is just to deny that it's even happening. And there's some other people who are angry, or there's those who are bargaining, and bargaining is just like, not only begging to God, but maybe even to white people. Like, okay, we'll do this if you do that. That may be where the respectability politics comes in. Like if we do this, then we can get that. It doesn't work that way, but that may be where they are at that stage of grief. And so just kind of remembering that this is a grieving process for everyone and it's going to look differently and there's no right or wrong way to do it. So that's the first step. So this is a multiple point answer. The next step would be addressing the anti-Black ideologies within other communities. So I know people are like, oh, the Black and brown people, should get together, Asian heritage should get together. Yes. Again, short answer, yes. But then let's not forget that we still have our Black brothers and sisters who are of Hispanic or Latinx ethnicity that are currently fighting for their civil rights as well. The Afro-Mexicans come to mind, right? They're not being acknowledged. And so that's something to kind of think about is we have to address, some of the prejudice and discrimination that exists within these other communities. 2. And then 3, going into, seeing that when one benefits, we all benefit. And I think specifically when the African American community benefits, so some type of trickle down effect that happens for the other, minority populations. I think of the National Immigration Act that came from the Civil Rights Movement. And that primarily, initiated non-European immigrants. So Black immigrants were not the only people to benefit from that, right? Other nations did as well. And I think that kind of goes into if there is a community effort for, the African American community, your communities will benefit as well. And then, of course, we can all unite together to defeat white supremacy. There's power in numbers.
So pausing right there, and I understand the importance of us uniting, but do you think these minority populations need to be just as vocal when their issues come up? And sometimes I feel a bit biased because I'm a Black woman, so I stay within the Black community. I don't know what's going on with white people, Asian people, Latina people. And I'll be very honest, my core group of friends are Black folk. Mm-hmm. And I know white people, but they're pretty much on the outer tier of how I have my friendships. Mm-hmm. I don't have intimate relationships with white people. So I'm like, I don't know what white people do.
Right. Yes, I do.
But, in these moments, once again, they'll post stuff and say, where's the outrage? And, that's a whole nother conversation. But do you think these other populations, white, brown, Indian, Latinos, do they need to be just as vocal regarding their issues? Because I feel like we don't see that in America. I feel like there will be sprinkles of stuff, but nothing like when a Black man gets murdered, which we'll just stop right there.
Are you saying they should be vocal about what's happening in the Black community?
Well,
or their personal communities?
If they want to join, that's great. If they don't, I understand. But I think within the personal community, I just feel, I hate to say this, but I think being in Texas is the truth. And I had a phone call today with a Hispanic woman who was in pain, but she's like, I don't want to go to the hospital. Right. Mm-hmm. So I think there is a level of deportation, not just for Hispanics, mm-hmm. but for all immigrants. My mom's an immigrant, so I get it. And I have a lot of sympathy for immigrants. Mm-hmm. But sometimes I wonder if that's why they're not as vocal with some of their issues.
That could definitely be one reason. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. That could definitely be one reason. I think before we can band together against white supremacy, that, everyone should, to the best of their ability, address inequalities in their community. Because those are essentially weaknesses, and so I think it's not to say, you do your thing, I'm going to do my thing, versus let's, prepare ourselves, right? So it's kind of similar to being on a team. Everyone is working out. You may have a strength and a weakness, and I have a different strength and weakness. And so we're making sure that we have positioned ourselves the best so we can play as a team to defeat the opponent. And I think it's the same concept. Yeah. The community is kind of restoring themselves, preparing themselves, and then moving forward. But I definitely think fear of deportation could definitely be one of them. Yeah. I think that is one, I don't want to say advantage that the African American community has. So I think when people think of immigrants, they only think of, Hispanics or Latinx or even Asians, even though Asians have a pretty extensive history within the United States, right? But they're still considered other immigrant in that regard. And I think we have a different veil that may give people a little more comfort. Because I saw this meme and someone said, where are the African and Caribbean people in the Black Lives Matter marches? And so someone said, well, are we supposed to distinguish ourselves? And so, that could be the thing. It's we can blend, right? And so, when we think about the African American community, citizenship is not a highlight of that community. And so we do kind of have a veil to kind of blend in a little bit more. So that could be one aspect of it. That's a really good point.
Yeah, and I discussed that. So I'm definitely going to have an episode on that because, I'm African, so that's important to me. But I'm Black, so people see my skin. They're not like, they don't care about my story until later.
Right.
Being that you are a Black woman, do you fight for, if you had to make a decision, do you fight for civil rights first or women's rights?
I think I fight for civil rights first because the reach is bigger, because it wouldn't just be me and my mom and my sisters. It would really be my whole family. And I think my race comes before my gender, because I'm a Black woman, not a woman who is Black. So in that regard, it's just recognizing that my skin is seen first and then my, gender. I don't think I choose, but if I had to, that's where it would be, because it would not only benefit, like I said, me, my mom, my sisters, aunts, and all that, but also, my husband, my family, my brothers, sons, nephews, like it will cover everyone. So I think that's where I would be.
Yeah, that's real. What else?
That's it.
You sure?
Yeah, we've hit everything.
How can people find you?
The first place I recommend everyone go is mindsovermelanin.com. We have a weekly blog that showcases the experiences of psychological or racial trauma through the experience of minorities. You can also find us on Twitter, Minds Over Mel, or even Instagram, Minds Over Melanin. I look forward to hearing from people. Please DM me, message me. I would love to hear your thoughts.
All right, everyone. Beautiful conversation. Yeah. I appreciate you, appreciate your time, appreciate your friendship. So, yeah, it's been great.
Likewise. Thank you for having me. This was phenomenal. Thank you for all the work that you do. I appreciate using your platform and your voice. You have been a consistent person. You really have.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Well, everyone, I hope you enjoyed that episode with Dr. E. Once again, just an important conversation to have. This is a topic that was new to me. I read the blog and I was fortunate to get her on this platform. And, this is why I have to come back every now and then, right? Find the right people, find the right topics. That way we can create the right conversations. Please listen, please share with your peers, share with your unit, and then have the conversation, right? Think like, man, have I suffered from racial trauma? And if you're Black, I can say it's easy to say yes. If we just look at this year, these 6 months, times are crazy right now. Man, please stay prayerful. Keep pushing and praying and pushing, and keep educating yourself. Equip your mind. And nothing's wrong with therapy. I know I'm an advocate for therapy. I have discussed my journey about therapy on here and even some other platforms. But let's continue to grow. Let's continue to evolve. Let's get the help. Let's take, have the self-care. Let's do what we have to do to become a better person in order for us to serve our family and communities better. So once again, shout out to Dr. E. Y'all, please support the lady. Check her out online, mindsovermelanin.com, as well as social media. The links are in the show notes. And remember, I believe in you. Personal connection leads to an influential network. Thanks for networking with Michelle. Peace and blessings.